Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Milwee, Trinity, Alabama, Mountain View Baptist Church. We want to continue our study today. I've entitled Grow Old Along with Me. It's from my book by the same title that I wrote a couple of years ago. And today we're going to get into the heart of the study. In fact, I've told people that if you only read 2 chapters in the book, you ought to read the chapter we're going to talk about today and the one we're going to talk about next week. Because the entire thrust of the book is that, churches ought not to just push aside their seniors, that seniors have valuable contributions to make. But the title of my chapter today is The Challenge, and the challenge is for seniors to understand that you can either be a blessing or a stumbling block in your church and in your ministry. People can either grow old gracefully, or they can grow older kicking and screaming. And I've encountered both. And so the purpose of these 2 chapters is to kind of give you illustrations and, of people that I've worked with that were difficult to work with. And then next week we'll look at people that were a blessing to work with. And so I just want to say up front, I've changed all the names. And if you attended one of my churches in the past, don't automatically assume that you know who I'm talking about, because this is church number 6 that I'm pastoring now. And, every church has some similar problems. In fact, I had an older pastor tell me when I first went in the ministry, he said, you don't just change churches, because you get frustrated somewhere because, just different church, same problems. And maybe that's a little pessimistic on his part, but it's true. I've encountered similar attitudes and actions in several different churches. And, conflict is inevitable. I knew that going into ministry. My dad was a pastor, and so I went in with my eyes wide open. I was not surprised, and we shouldn't be surprised. When you bring a couple hundred people together and everybody from different backgrounds, people have different ideas about how we ought to do things and all that. So as pastors, we have to learn how to deal with conflict. And so having said that, I want to begin the chapter by telling you a story that happened in one of my first churches. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I was settling into my office after only a few months of work, and there was a knock at the door. And I welcomed one of our older ladies into my office, and we spoke for just a moment. And then she asked me if I had a piece of paper. And I said, sure. So I opened a drawer, and I reached down. I got a piece of paper, and I handed it to her. And she took that piece of paper, and let me just get one. I'll demonstrate what she did. Let's see. So I handed her that piece of paper just like this, And she took that piece of paper, and this is what she did. She threw it against the wall as hard as she could. And then she turned to me and she pointed at me and she said, "That's how you make me feel." Well, she certainly had my attention. And I asked her, I was just taken aback, by this dramatic presentation. And I said, well, please tell me what I've done to, produce such a passionate reaction. And she said, last night in the meeting, when you said the nursery looks horrible and we need to clean it up and completely redo it, if we ever expect to reach any young families in our community, you hurt my feelings. You have no idea how hard that we'd already worked in the nursery. You'd think we had never done anything until you showed up. Well, I apologized and I asked for her forgiveness. But the truth of the matter is, the nursery did look horrible. It desperately needed to be updated and remodeled. But I learned a valuable lesson through this experience. You have to use tact and good judgment when working with people. As the old saying goes, you catch more bees with honey than vinegar. You never want people to think that you are discounting everything they've ever done until you came along. The extra effort of working behind the scenes, building relationships, bringing people along with you, pays rich dividends over time. Certainly working with senior adults can be challenging. It requires patience and understanding. Most of the seniors that I've worked with through the years grew up during the Great Depression. Also, many of them lived through World War II. They have experienced more significant changes during their lifetime than many people have for centuries. Most have handled this very well, while others struggle to get along, in our modern world. Therefore, it's helpful to take all this into consideration when you're met with resistance and even sometimes outright conflict. Considering my love for senior adults, you might mistakenly assume that I never had to deal with any conflict or difficulty when working with this age group, but you'd be greatly mistaken. I've had more than my share of challenges working with this age group, but I never once thought about asking anyone to leave the church. I believe this is a rookie mistake some pastors make, and they suffer the consequences of this unfortunate decision. I'll give an example. I once followed in the footsteps of a pastor who was relieved of his duties because he tried to make significant changes too rapidly. I heard the story numerous times of how people showed up for church on one particular Sunday, and this is what they found. The choir loft had been cleared of all chairs, all the pulpit furniture was missing, and in its place was a drum set, some amps and guitars, and a music stand. And the pastor, stood up and boldly declared, "This is how it's going to be from now on. And if you don't like it, don't let the door hit you on the way out." Well, guess who was out the door in less than a month? It wasn't the seniors who had been there for years. It was this inexperienced pastor who tried to move too quickly and tried too brazenly to force his agenda upon the congregation. We eventually had drums and guitars as part of the worship service in that church, but these things were added gradually over time. However, this wasn't achieved without difficulty, especially in light of these previous events. It seems that the patriarch of that particular church had lived a uproarious life when he was younger, and unfortunately the upbeat, lively music reminded him of the places that he frequented when he was younger. This all came to a head one Sunday evening when the people started clapping along as we were singing "Victory in Jesus." Well, right in the middle of people clapping and singing "Victory in Jesus," he stood up and threw his hands up in the air, and he turned around and walked out with a big look of disgust on his face. Well, I never considered "Victory in Jesus" to be an offensive song, and so I was surprised by his actions. Apparently, he wasn't offended by the song, but by the clapping. His wife later sent me a note listing all the verses in the Bible that mention clapping in a derogatory manner. Well, he eventually came back, and we continued to clap, but he was not happy about it. He repeatedly told me, "I don't want any of that honky-tonk music in this church." Well, I don't think they're singing "Victory in Jesus" down at the local tavern, but I might be mistaken. Seniors can be particularly set in their ways and very resistant to change, but I have to remind myself that I can also be that way. Developing people skills is an essential character trait every leader must undertake, and I've developed mine through the School of Hard Knocks, and I'm sure you have too. For instance, in one of my very first business meetings, I made a motion and nobody seconded the motion. I mean, can you imagine? I'm in, my first church. I make this motion. I don't even remember what it was that I wanted us to do, but I made the motion, and then there was silence. Everybody was nervously looking around, and nobody spoke up. Finally, I said, "Well, I guess this is something we just don't want to do. Let's move on." It was embarrassing, but I learned to never go into a business meeting without talking to key leaders and letting them make the motions. The first major conflict I ever dealt with directly with a senior adult was over money. Now, I'll admit this church was small, but I felt we needed to work under the auspices of a budget. Up until my arrival, the standard operating procedure at this particular church was for the treasurer to control the money. He was an elderly Irishman, and he was accustomed to getting the final say on how the money was spent. For instance, I quickly discerned that if it was something that he liked, we always had the money. But if it was some idea that he didn't like, then we never had the money to do it. Well, as you can imagine, I wasn't happy with this arrangement. Therefore, I asked him to come to my office one day to discuss the finances, and I mean, things quickly escalated. I proposed adopting a church budget and then spending the funds however the church decided. And his face began to get redder and redder. He was highly insulted that I would suggest another way of doing things. He snarled, "We did it this way long before you got here, and we'll be doing it this way long after you're gone." I mean, he really let his Irish temper get the best of him. I even noticed he was starting to ball up his fist. I thought he might be about to hit me. Well, I didn't try to argue with him. I never even mentioned it again until we had our next church council meeting, of which he was a member. And I began my portion of the meeting by stating, "I'd like to propose that we adopt a church budget. But I've been told this is not the way that you do things. In fact, I've been told that the way you're doing things is how you've always done them, and you'll be doing them this way long after I'm gone. But, I can't really operate this way. We need to spend money on the things we approve of as a church and not leave it up to one individual to decide." So I shared with the folks, I said, I'm going to step outside and I'm going to let you guys talk about how you want to operate. Well, as I said this, all the eyes in the room turned toward this fiery Irishman. Apparently, he had used these same tactics in the past. Well, later on that evening, I was approached by one of our African-American deacons, who was this huge, muscular guy. He actually was the assistant principal at a large high school in charge of discipline. And he came up to me, and in his deep baritone voice, he said, "He won't be messing with you anymore." And I'm going to say, to his credit, this guy came to me and apologized for his behavior. He even asked me if I wanted he and his wife to leave the church. And I said, "No, I don't want you to leave the church, but I want you to work with me." And you know what? We never had any more problems after that. In fact, when I did finally leave the church, his wife came up to me and she was upset. She said, "You were supposed to do my funeral." Money can bring out the best and the worst in people, especially among folks who lived through the Great Depression. They want to save everything, and they don't want to spend money on anything. Unfortunately, this can sometimes have tragic consequences. Many years ago, before iPads and iPhones and digital everything, people used this little thing called a camera. There was even this little device called a Polaroid camera, which would actually shoot the photo out of the bottom of the device whenever you took a photograph. So it was time for our vacation Bible school, and we had this extremely excited young mother who just happened to be a new Christian, and she wanted to do something to help. So we gave her the Polaroid camera, and we asked her to take photographs of the children. She was young, she was new, she was excited, she was so happy to be able to help out that she took lots of photographs. In fact, she took so many photographs that one of the older women severely chastised her for wasting all that expensive film. Well, she was so hurt by that experience that she left the church and she never came back. Listen, the price of a roll of film is not worth being a stumbling block to a new Christian. Jesus once said, "Whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, it is better for him for a great millstone to be hung around his neck and thrown into the sea." Well, along those lines, we had a work day at the large church where I was serving as a youth pastor, and I was given the task of cleaning out a closet in one of the adult Sunday school rooms. So I went through that closet and I threw away everything that, seemed like to me was useless. Later that afternoon, though, I was walking by the dumpster, and I was surprised to see one of the senior adult ladies had actually climbed over into the dumpster. I don't even know how she got over in there, but she was holding up this styrofoam head like you might see at a thrift store, with a wig sitting on it. She held this styrofoam head up and she angrily shouted, "Who threw this away?" Well, I timidly answered, I did. And she then castigated me for throwing away a perfectly good styrofoam head and said they used it for something, but for the life of me, I can't remember what she said they used it for. I was just flabbergasted that she was over in the dumpster going through the items that we had thrown away. Many years later at a different church, we had rented a 2-ton dumpster to go through and clear out a tremendous amount of clutter that had accumulated in the church. Which, brings me to one of my soapbox issues. If you got something you don't want, don't donate it to the church. We don't want your junk or your trash. Give the Lord your best. Every church I've pastored, and I get there, there's just rooms full of junk that people have brought up to the church because they didn't want to throw it away. And the church just accumulates all this stuff, and then somebody has to deal with it. Give the Lord your best. So anyway, that's my soapbox for today. But here's the amazing part. That huge dumpster wouldn't even hold everything. So we put caution tape around this huge pile of rubble until we could get another dumpster delivered to haul away the rest of the junk. That Sunday after church, I had a long line of seniors asking me for items in the junk pile. Now, we might be tempted to laugh at that in our throwaway society, but these folks who lived through the Great Depression could teach us a lot about thrift and needless waste. However, things can get downright ridiculous. Some are so resistant to change, not because there's anything wrong with the proposed change, but because it's different from what they're accustomed to. My favorite story related to this happened while I was pastoring a church in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I had enlisted one of our men who was a very talented woodworker to build me a smaller pulpit. The pulpit in this particular church was so huge that we had to lay it down on its side anytime we had a baptism so people could see the baptistry. I always jokingly said I thought I was standing behind a big Buick, every time that I would preach. So we had a children's program. We'd had to move it out of the auditorium so we could see the kids, and I was using a music stand while this guy was building me the new pulpit. Well, this continued for about 3 weeks until finally one Sunday, one of our older ladies approached me and she said, "Pastor, when are we going to put that pulpit back in place?" And I enthusiastically told her, "Well, we're not. I got this guy. He's building me a brand new one. It's going to be a little smaller, more my size. I'm so excited about it." And she said, "Well, Pastor, it's just not church without that pulpit." And I replied, I said, "Well, now, come on." I said, "You don't really think that Jesus had a pulpit when he preached the Sermon on the Mount, do you?" She shot back, "I know he did, and I have pictures to prove it." Now, I'm usually good at maintaining my composure, but when she said that, I did just what I just did. I burst out laughing. I just couldn't help it. I said, "Well, if you got some pictures to prove it, I sure would like to see them." Well, later on, she brought me some of those Sunday school drawings, which they do for children, and it was of Jesus standing in the temple behind some kind of lectern that somebody had drawn. But, the damage was done. She never forgave me for laughing at her. She was holding on to tradition for the sake of tradition, which leads to a much more serious discussion of times when seniors have seriously jeopardized our ability to move forward as a church. Holding on to tradition for the sake of tradition, listen to me, it can be detrimental to the Lord's work. Let me give you a few examples. I was once pastoring a church that was so small that we didn't have any children. We didn't have any children, but we had a plan. We had remodeled the nursery. Remember that crumpled up paper story? We got the nursery remodeled. And we designated a particular Sunday for people to work in the nursery. Just in case somebody showed up, with young children. People had taken a different Sunday. I'll do it the first Sunday, I'll do it the second, that sort of thing. So not long into this arrangement, a beautiful young couple showed up one Sunday morning with 2 or 3 precious children. I don't remember how many. This was an answer to our prayers. We had been praying that God would reach out to many young families in our community, and this couple came with, their little ones, and I greeted them at the door, but at the same time, I turned to somebody and I whispered, and I said, "Run and get Mary Lou." It was her Sunday to be in the nursery per our arrangement. And my plan was to kind of keep this family occupied, to give her time to get around there to the nursery before we arrived. But regrettably, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, because just a moment later, the front doors, double doors of the sanctuary violently swung open. I mean, it was like, and Mary Lou stomped by, and as she passed by with clear agitation in her voice, she looked over her shoulder and she said, "I'll do it this time, Pastor, but don't ever ask me again." Well, as you can imagine, the young mother immediately tensed up. And she said, "Oh my, is there a problem?" And I said, "Well, it appears there might be. Why don't you just let the kids come in the service with you? I love children. I'm sure they're going to be fine in the service." And of course, the young couple never came back. But I tracked them down a couple of weeks later, and I profusely apologized for what had happened. And the lady, she compassionately said, "Oh, Pastor," she said, "don't worry about it." She said, "My father is a pastor, and I felt so sorry for you." Fortunately, the church was later blessed with an older couple who had a genuine love and compassion for children. They volunteered to stay in the nursery almost every Sunday. The church began to grow. We were then blessed with a number of children. Even one family with triplets started to attend. It all happened because this older couple saw a need and decided that they were going to meet this need. Unlike Linda Lou, who helped us lose the first couple that God sent our way, this couple blessed our church with a willing heart and a generous spirit. I still remember this very kind, godly lady pulling me aside one day, and she whispered, she said, "No offense, Pastor, but we've heard thousands of sermons. We believe that this is where God wants to use us at this time." And you know what? She was absolutely right, and the Lord richly blessed our church because of their efforts. Senior adults with their hearts in the right place can be a tremendous blessing to any congregation. However, if we're not careful, we can develop a sense of ownership and entitlement that can hurt the church's efforts as it tries to reach out. For instance, I one time had to speak with a sweet older lady at one of the churches where I was the pastor because she kept telling our guests that they were sitting in her seat. I mean, obviously it's where she had sat for many years, but she didn't own that seat. It didn't belong to her. And I tried to help her to see how off-putting this behavior was to people who were visiting our church. Similarly, we once planned an Easter egg hunt in a local park to try to attract young families to our church. We intentionally sought out a park close to the church instead of doing it at the church in an effort to reach out into our community and to hopefully reach some new families, or at least make contact with some potential new families. And I thought that we had clearly communicated this to everyone, but apparently not. Because just as we were about to begin the hunt, something happened that just completely threw a damper over the entire experience. A number of us had arrived early. We got everything set up. We prepared the refreshments. We set up games. We scattered all the eggs. We were ready. The kids were lined up, ready to go. I was about to give the signal to start when this beautiful young couple walked by. I mean, just the type of couple that we're trying to reach. And one of their kids saw all the brightly colored eggs, and she reached down to pick it up. And to my horror, one of our older ladies screamed, "Don't touch that, it's for our Sunday school kid." I wanted to die. I mean, she completely missed the point. I mean, this was the reason we're out in the park to start with. The eggs were not just for our Sunday school kids. They were for any child that might want to have one. Well, needless to say, we didn't pick up any new contacts that day. Ironically, I experienced something similar one Saturday morning. I decided I'd ride my bicycle up to the church and spend a little time in prayer and look over my sermon notes for Sunday. And obviously, I didn't have on my usual Sunday morning attire. I was wearing shorts and a T-shirt. I also had on a bicycle helmet, and I was wearing sunglasses. At the precise moment I was getting off my bicycle and walking toward the front of the church, an older ladies' prayer group was coming out of the fellowship hall. And I'm sure they have been praying for our efforts to reach our community for Christ. But this didn't prevent one of the ladies from yelling at me, "Hey, what are you doing? Get away from here." Well, I calmly took off my helmet and sunglasses, and I said to her in front of all the others, "Now, is that any way to talk to your pastor?" And they all laughed, but then I said, "What if I'd been somebody from our community walking up to try to see what time the service started?" You see, unfortunately, we sometimes get so overprotective of the buildings that we forget about the souls that we're trying to reach. Well, this brings me back around to that difficult patriarch in one of my early churches. When I first went to the church was renting space to a Chinese congregation, and they always met out in the fellowship hall on Sunday afternoons for their worship service. And the good news is that church grew so large that they bought their own facility, and we were making plans for their departure. And at the same time, we were approached by a Korean congregation who wanted to rent some space. However, instead of worshiping in the fellowship hall, they really wanted to worship in the sanctuary. It was very important for them and their culture to worship in the sanctuary. And so I was presenting this request to the deacons, and yes, regrettably, this difficult man was one of our deacons. And I began to express the request of these folks when Mr. Difficult spoke up. And he said, "Oh, I didn't mind having those people in the fellowship hall, but I don't want them in the sanctuary." Well, this blatant racist comment just infuriated me. And so I said, "Well, Mr. Smith," and of course I've changed that name. I said, "What do you think heaven's going to be like?" And he slammed both fists down on the table, and he said, "Well, this ain't heaven." And he jumped up and stormed out like he had done several times in the past. And this time he didn't come back for a long, long time. You see, it's very sad when we let our prejudices and pride of ownership get in the way of the Lord's work. That Korean church stayed for a while, and today it's one of the largest Korean congregations in that particular city. So praise God for that. So as you can see, I've had more than my share of conflicts, confrontations, misunderstandings with seniors, but I love them anyway. I love them anyway because they are part of the flock entrusted to my care. I love them for their wisdom and insight. I love them for their stories. I love them for their long years of dedication and service. But as I said earlier, it seems to me there are two types of old people: those who grow bitter and those who grow better. Some age gracefully, while others enter the later stages of life kicking and screaming. Some are a tremendous blessing, while others are tremendously draining and burdensome. The Apostle Paul said near the end of his life, "For I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who love his appearing." We all want to hear the Lord say to us someday, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I hope we'll all be able to say with Paul, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." Let me challenge and implore you today to do whatever you have to do to be a blessing and not a burden to those around you. Now, if you'll come back next week, I'm going to share story after story of people who have been a blessing and a joy to be around, and you don't want to miss that. I hope I'll see you again next week. Thanks for watching today. God bless you.